Hello. Good evening. What a full house. Such great energy. I'm so glad you guys are here. My name is David Simpson. I'm the program director here at FOC. My pronouns are his, him, something, his, him, his, him, his, him, his, he, him. Thank you. So fucking awkward, I'm sorry. Welcome to the first faculty event of our inaugural Queer Week. One of our favorite parts of the summer workshops is that every Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, our incredible faculty mesmerize audiences of students and general public with presentations and talks, all of which are free and open to the public. Tonight we're going to hear from writer Alexander Chee and photographer Jess T. Dugan. Let's give it up. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. Alexander and Jess's books will be for sale at the back of the room after the event. So go back there and they'll be signing their books also. Books by other members of this year's faculty are also for sale at the back and also in the bookstore in between the two halves of the gallery. The gallery is open until 8 o'clock after the event tonight with our summer exhibition, Everyone We Know Is Here, which is curated by former fellow Heidi Hahn and contains work by 20 or so former fellows. So it's a great show. I encourage you to check it out if you haven't already done so. Big shout out to East End Books, who helps us manage our bookstore, provides all the books and keeps the books flowing. Restrooms are down the hall. The sign-up sheet for Thursday night, student night, is on that table. And I have to say, I'm a little disappointed to see that there are only 2 people signed up. So if you haven't signed up, which is most of you, I encourage you to do so because you won't be sorry. It's always my favorite night of the week. I weep virtually every week because I'm so inspired by the bravery that everyone shows to get up and share their work and the love that is shown to every single person that gets up on the stage. So you'll have the best hometown, home audience that you'll ever get. So I encourage you to sign up if you haven't. New development. We have an apartment that's available. So if you know anybody who's here, if there's anybody here who's like camping and might not like to get rained on all week, there's an apartment available for a discounted rate if you're interested. See Sarah after the event. Finally, please do us all a favor and turn your cell phones to silent. Typically at this point, I'd invite a fellow staff member up to introduce the first speaker, but we're not going to do it that way. We've been trying to think of ways to improve our faculty introductions, kind of up our game. And Melissa Phoebos gave us a great idea, which is to invite students to introduce their instructors. Great idea. So we're going to do that. So to start, we're going to bring up one of Alexander's students to the stage to introduce him. And I'd like to invite Tochukwu Okafor to the stage. Thank you.
Good evening. Okay, good evening. When reflecting on his work, writing and process, Alexander Chee feels painfully relatable and full of aching reflection. One also immediately understands the painstaking devotion his writing commands. His work asks us to contemplate the largest questions about identity, sexuality, family, art, and war, allowing readers to absorb the wisdom of a life fully lived. These sentiments describe his body of work from Edinburgh to The Queen of the Night and how to write an autobiographical novel. Beneath all the accomplishments of his craft, Alexander Chee is fully human, a literary citizen, a force of nature in flux. In his introduction to the 2022 Best American Essays, his concern for our world shines through. Chee carefully, justifiably despairs. He writes, "By January of 2021, I had lost faith in even the idea that writing might improve anything between people, but especially the idea that writing could or should teach empathy or offer an education on biases to the enemies of an equitable, multiracial, liberal democracy, and that essays could do it." But Chee's despair rings with optimism and a call for redemption. He reminds us towards the end of his introductory reflection that if I wanted safety, it was the safety the truth provides. Alexander Chee's graceful, meditative truth shows through each contribution he has made to the New York Times, Slate, Guernica, and Tin House. He has garnered a Whiting Award, a Randy Shields Prize in Gay Nonfiction, a United States Artist Fellowship, and a Guggenheim Fellowship in Nonfiction. In addition, he is a contributing editor at the New Republic, an editor-at-large at VQR, Virginia Quarterly Review, and an associate professor at Dartmouth. Please welcome Alexander Chee.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction. I have a slight edit on my bio. I'm a full professor now. I was telling my friend Nami Moon about it, and I said, I feel full of this fuck you energy. And she was like, but who? Who are you saying fuck you to? And I was like, that's a very good question. Anyway, so the theme of our class this week is self-censorship, and writing our way through it, and trying to learn how we censor ourselves and how we can take back those selves. And I was thinking about what I should read tonight, and I thought I would read this fragment. I thought there was more of it in my Google Docs, but there is not, which is so telling, right? Basically what happened is that on a faculty leave that I was able to take, thanks to the Guggenheim, I was going through files related to a whole other book altogether and found a novel that I had forgotten that I had gotten deep into in the 90s. Had the serrated dot matrix printer edges. And I was really thrown because I had been having the exact same impulse earlier, just like months earlier, where I thought, those stories should be a novel. You should make them into a novel. Pull those out. And so I found it while I was doing that. And it was so uncanny because I remembered being a college student and reading Marguerite Duras' The War Journals, which was like a hugely influential book to me, but also reading her intro where she describes forgetting that she's written these journals and thinking, how do you just forget a book? Anyway, now I know. This book, the easiest way to describe it, I suppose, I think it's actually pretty fairly self-descriptive. It comes from when I was in ACT UP and Queer Nation in San Francisco in the early 90s and late 80s. And And it's about the time that I was asked to find out if my boyfriend was a police plant. So now I'm trying to figure out how do I revise it? Do I keep it set in the 90s? Do I make a bridge from the present into the past? You know, at the same time that I was having these thoughts, I had been, well, I guess that it really started during quarantine. I had reached out to old friends from ACT UP. I was trying to write something about the parallels between COVID and AIDS, and I was remembering a demonstration that was a kind of accidental demonstration where a bunch of us went to a theme park, and because the owners of the theme park thought we were there to demonstrate, they tried to keep us out of the park. And we actually just wanted to go to the park, and so we had a demonstration to get into the park. A self-fulfilling prophecy. So I was calling around to these friends and trying to get them to remember something that we probably all hadn't thought of in, like, you know, the decade since. And what was so funny to me is that people remembered the episode, but they remembered different theme parks, different drag queens, different friends who were there. The only thing that we did really remember was that we protested. Anyway, this novel, I'll read a fragment of this, and then I will read a short excerpt from another novel in progress. So this is Blue is Not the Sky. And it begins with an epigraph from John Ash. It half seems that the war will end forever, for surely they must soon fall in love with each other. And the painter knows his painting must be heroic, that the blue is not the sky, but a terrible sea a god has raised to drown the beauty of the young men in the marble battlefield of the station. And he knows the painting is finished, that it represents the envy the divine must feel towards the human, as marble must envy the sea. We'd abducted our good friend Will from outside the general meeting for ACT UP in San Francisco. I was giggling as soon as we were close enough to do what we did. Ed shook his head as he slid a hood over Will's head. I took the cigarette from Ed's hand as if it came down by agreement, as if we had worked out custody of the lit cigarette, and put it in my mouth as I put the handcuffs on his wrists. Jessie was waiting in her car as we approached, and she got out to let us drive. A pacer, I said, taking in the features of her classic vehicle. You drive a fucking pacer? Will roared with laughter underneath his hood. I knew it was you guys. You can't even pull off a fucking kidnapping. He was right. We were taking him to a motel room rented to celebrate his birthday. The motel was a little place in the Marina District, far from where we usually hung out, and not too cheap, as we wanted him to feel special. We drove over in Jessie's car, with me and Ed in the front seats, and Ed driving as usual. Miguel was with Jessie in the back seat on either side of Will, who sat bound and hooded, content to meet his fate. Looking back, I can see that we wanted to scare him maybe just a tiny bit with this plot, maybe because he was scaring us with his talks about preparing for war. The Dutch couple who he knew could get us out of the country and into Amsterdam for $2,000. A woman's ranch up north that would let us stay on the land, away from the main buildings, of course, until they could get us into Canada. He asked us if we had our vaccinations, the lack of which would be an obstacle to entry in most countries. He was sure the invasion of Kuwait was the beginning of another Vietnam, and that this time the gay excuse wouldn't work. Why would a government that wants us dead keep us out of the line of fire? I still remember the time he said this to me. He was pulling on his blonde beard like a sexy dwarf warrior out of Lord of the Rings. I met his eyes, always so startlingly blue, and said, "You just see, I will go down to that recruitment center myself and say, how many dicks do I have to suck to have you keep me out of the army? And once you figure it out, line them up, honey." He said nothing, He didn't like me teasing him this way, but it seems to me now he understood the danger we were in a way that I didn't want to. For all I liked to believe, I was committed to living in the truth of this world. The joke I made that day, I repeated again and again at demonstrations in bars and cafes. It became my wartime shtick anytime the draft came up, my soft shoe for the girls at the cafe floor on Market Street. He wasn't scared, though, or at least not by us. He didn't think we could do much, to be honest, except give up or give in. We loved him for this investment in our bad futures. It helped us to keep them away. I don't know what he loved us for or what he thought we were doing. He's dead now, and I still don't have those answers. But in any case, let's stay in the moment a little longer, 23 years ago. His birthday, a car ride, a hotel room. Ed and I with bandanas around our mouths, as if that might keep us hidden from anything. We continued with the gag as far as the door to the room. We undid the cuffs, took off the hood, sang happy birthday and ordered pizza. We played Russ Meyer's Faster Pussycat Kill Kill on a rented VCR, reveling in the big-breasted bisexual heroines on the run, and then watched the Pet Sematary documentary Gates of Heaven. We'd forgotten to kidnap or otherwise recruit a date for Will, and of course, Will had unfinished business back at the meeting. He had wanted to address what he felt was the alarming apologism of some of the group's members toward the elected officials we were trying to reach about the war protests. He had mentioned also his fears that the group had been infiltrated by the police. In retrospect, us taking him just before he could speak to the group about police infiltration might have suggested that we were police, any of us. But what happened that night was that as he and I were saying goodbyes, he turned to me very serious and asked me if I thought Ed was a police plant. No, I said. Okay, he said. But find out. I need you to find out. I will, I said, having no idea what that would mean. For reasons I wasn't entirely clear about at the time, at some point after I met Ed, I stopped speaking to white people almost altogether. I still spoke to them for work. I was a barista at a coffee bar in the Castro neighborhood of San Francisco, so there were ways of exchanging pleasantries. I was in no position to live apart then, though I suppose I could have if I wanted to or intended to. I think the point to me was just that I lived in a Latino neighborhood owned almost entirely by Chinese Americans. My boss Rod was Jamaican, Ed, my lover, was Mexican, and as for my white friends, I had noticed something, which is that if I didn't call them, they never called me. So I decided to test it to see if I was just imagining it. I stopped calling them. I couldn't even say calling them back, actually. All of my voicemails were from my Asian friends, black friends, Latino friends, my mom, my white mom. She called me. I guess I was waiting for these friends to notice. I feared I had mistaken their tolerant friendliness for friendship, and I was drowning in it. When I saw them on the street, we waved, and it was as though I were inside of an aquarium, and they were outside, as brisk as paying visitors. Not even a, hey, how are you, or just a quick wave or a smile. It was like when you watch TV with the sounds off at a bar, the music playing off the jukebox, and you have to figure out if you really are watching what is happening based on their expressions, the eye conversations, the smiles or frowns. I could see their gestures clearly, untroubled by spoken assurances. I could see, on the whole, their initial hesitancy, and I wondered if they saw it too, or if it troubled them, or if they were fine with it. They were around me like some silent milk tide, and I ducked under, and in doing so, entered the most enormous silence I had ever known. Ed and I had begun like this. 4 months earlier, I had been involved with a very nice white man named Rob. He was from Chicago, educated at Brown, had arrived in San Francisco with the rosy cheeks and smiles he had every day we were together. He avoided the sun, read enormously, but without stamina, rarely finishing anything. He aspired not so much to being a writer, but to beginning to write. He was like many of the people I knew when I arrived in San Francisco in 1989, and that he was a white gay man with an undergraduate liberal arts degree who worked at a high-paying job he hated in order to pay off his college loans. He ran a newsletter for a medical insurance company and valued intellectual pursuits, at least in spirit, as a way to protect himself while doing this work. He had moved there thinking there were other places he could be gay, but perhaps nowhere where it might be so fun as here, in that land where nothing had been able to take root except those things that suited the lives of nomads, transients, religious fanatics, the leaders of failed revolutions, and a few successful ones. He and I were of the same social class in our way. My school, Wesleyan, resembled his, at least in liberal reputation and cost. We had school friends who'd had affairs or knew of each other or knew of us, or we were soon going to know each other, soon perhaps even going to have affairs past each other. People like Rob were always saying, small world, and I would say, small social class. And maybe this is why they didn't call me. There was a road you could take from Brown to San Francisco, and it went more or less through Brown and Wesleyan each way. If you lived on that road, it was really small. And we lived like gods there, but gods who do not yet know what it costs to live like that. If I shared anything with Rob beyond a social class and desire for men, it was a love of literature, and in this love we took refuge from each other's differences when all other methods of mediating them had failed us. On the last night we were together, we went to a reading at Small Traffic Press, an independent radical publisher of manifestos, chapbooks, and books in the Mission District that also had its own bookstore. It was a small white room, defiantly unrenovated and lit by those fluorescent lights that always made me feel a little numb. The press was located at the place the Mission neighborhood and Noe Valley neighborhood met, which seemed to define it also, and every time I went there I felt approved of more than welcomed. Wooden shelves were built into the walls, black metal freestanding magazine spinners clustered in the corners to make room for the chairs. We were there listening to my friend Ann Tony debut a short story. He was a performance artist from Stockton. The night when I had met him, he had just shaved off all of his body hair on stage, putting all of it in a bag while documenting it on video. He'd outfitted himself in a cloth diaper, and on the whole carried himself with the aplomb of someone who had grown up on the back of his dad's Harley in Stockton. The assembled group was made of Ann Tony's friends, artists and writers, a few strangers no one seemed to know, except the people who brought them, like I had with Rob. I had met most of them before and thought of them as a group study in artistic temperament. Rob and I had finished an unusually quiet dinner earlier across the street. He had few openly gay friends at the time, and most of his friends were generally like him, white, unambitious, amiable in the way of children, working at high-paying temp jobs I never knew how to find, taken to pay off their college debts. I had spent the previous 4 years of my life and much of my childhood around people like this, and I was running patience with all of it, but I didn't think of it that way at the time. I just thought of how I had nothing really to say to them. My life looked increasingly bewildering to them, and sometimes to me. My newer friends were artists like Ann Tony, or they were porn actors, go-go dancers, drag queens, or they taught college or high school. One drag queen friend wore a pin that said, "I really am a rocket scientist," his day job. Another wore one that said, "I don't speak English," which was a lie, but would point at it if someone came to complain about what he was wearing. Or they were some mix of these things. I knew the outreach counselors for the addicts in crisis, and I knew the addicts also. My closest friends were people I had met in the general meetings of ACT UP and Queer Nation, and these friends had never quite connected with Rob. They called each other girl no matter their gender, enjoyed costumes during the day as well as at night, and their enthusiasm for the arrests that came with civil disobedience seemed to display a kind of confidence in their government that the protests did not. Ann Tony was Mexican-American, pale and redheaded. The assembled group that evening around him was mostly made up of his friends, lovers, artists, and writers with underground careers of varying success, and a few people that no one seemed to know except the people who'd brought them. I had the feeling of wanting to say something to Robert with something like desperation, even though I couldn't imagine what that was. Robert stood next to me at my elbow with his hands in his pockets, wearing the secondhand clothes I associated with the uniform of temps, a blue cotton broadcloth shirt that he could wear to work along with his flat front khaki pants, and a houndstooth windbreaker, faded black Converse sneakers. He'd recently gotten a crew cut and looked like a catalog model from the 1950s who had escaped into the present, trying to look casual in the 80s. I was examining him, I realized, when he noticed me doing this, and he said, "What?" "I don't know," I said. "You look nice," I said, dodging whatever it was I was feeling. "When you look at me that way, I feel like you're waiting for me to say something," he said, and I never know what to say. I had not dodged it then. Robert looked at me always like I was a cat and he was a mouse, and that's not a terrible way to describe us, except I wasn't going to eat him, but he was always going to look at me that way, I came to understand. And so that night, I just broke up with him, left the reading, and drove my motorcycle across the city to where I knew Ed would be. Skinny, with black hair and dark skin, Ed had driven his Honda Nighthawk all the way from El Paso, Texas, and walked into the bookstore where I worked a few days earlier. And it was like a scene from a Western, if the metal detector was the doors of the saloon. The sun cast his shadow such that the straps of his motorcycle boots caught my eye. He was standing in the doorway of the bookstore, just past the metal detector, and as my eye traveled up to his face, I found him waiting for me to meet his glance. He nodded, like a cowboy in a Western seeing the saloon girl he has just fallen in love with. And I couldn't tell you if I blushed, but I burned. "Who the hell is that?" my coworker asked me after he turned and left. "I'll tell you as soon as I find out," I said, and I absolutely meant it. I'll stop there. Guess there was more than I thought. Anyway, let's welcome Jess Dugan. And their introducer.
Let's give it up for Alexander Chee. And now I'd like to invite Kaylee McDonald to the stage, who's going to introduce Jess Dugan. Kaylee.
Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Kaylee, and it is my delight and honor to introduce to you our faculty speaker and a long-term inspiration of mine, Jess T. Dugan. And first, I would like to say that it's fitting for Jess to be lecturing tonight alongside writer Alexander Chee, and to be conducting their class alongside writing and poetry workshops. Jess's portraiture feels to be deeply embedded with the poetic, so this feels like a very special place to be. Jess T. Dugan was born in Mississippi and raised in Little Rock, Arkansas. It was there that they became enraptured by the art of photography, where the darkroom exposed their passion for capturing vulnerability through portraiture. Experimenting with photography allowed them to grapple with themes of gender, sexuality, and identity, igniting a process that would carry them through the halls of the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, Harvard, Columbia, Chicago, and eventually gaining recognition as a champion of change by the White House. Jess's work was introduced to me at a critical moment in my life. I was a freshman in art school, studying photography, nervous and painfully shy. To go into all that Jess's work continues to provide for me would be too long of a speech, and I'm limited to 3 minutes. But to put it most simply, Jess Dugan's photographs liberated me. They were a guide and steady companion as I navigated my way through those formative years at the foundation of my practice. Seeing their work felt like being seen, each photograph a miracle. The International Center of Photography noted that their work transcends the field of documentary photography while revealing narratives that challenge heteronormative culture through arresting portraiture. Their most recent exhibitions include Coupled at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, To Survive on This Shore at the Ruth S. Kaddish Gallery inside the San Francisco International Airport, and Letter to My Father at the Robert and Elaine Stein Galleries of Wright State University. I'm so incredibly grateful for this week of mentorship, and as we all continue our week here, I invite you to take a page from any one of Jess's fabulous books. That is, to allow yourself the glorious space of authenticity and pause. Please welcome Jess Dugan.
Hi, everyone. Bear with me 1 second for some tech here. Oh, that's okay, I think. Do you mind going that way a tiny bit? Okay. I see you've already made it short for me, so that's good. How is that? Can you guys hear me? Is this better? Yes. How's that? Okay. I'm going to put this screen all the way down because I know I'm short, so hopefully you can see me over it. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm super touched. And to David and Sarah, I think we should stick with this plan. It's really lovely and very sweet and moving. So thank you so much. I also just wanted to thank everyone at the Fine Arts Work Center for having me here this week. This is one of my favorite places in the world, one of the most magical places that I am lucky enough to spend time. And I'm incredibly grateful to everyone here at the Work Center who makes this happen every year, and also a special shout out to Andrea Lawler for inviting me to be part of Queer Week. I was telling the Work Center folks that my workshops often feel very queer, but it's like kind of magical for all of the Work Center to feel queer, and I'm like totally into it. So I'm going to share my work with you this evening. I'm going to go through the general trajectory of my career and talk about 3 main bodies of work. So as a little bit of a background, I've been working with photography for almost 20 years now in a serious capacity, and from the very beginning, I was drawn to portraiture. The workshop I'm teaching this week is called The Intimate Portrait, and I have an amazing group of students. I meant to share that earlier. I'm really excited about the week. So from the very beginning of my photographing, I was really drawn to portraiture. Making pictures for me is the way that I connect with other people in the world. It's the way I relate to the world around me. It's the way I understand myself. I can always tell, usually in hindsight, what questions I've been working out about my own identity and my own experiences through my photographs. So my practice is so deeply interwoven with my life in a way that's very meaningful to me. This body of work is called Every Breath We Drew. I began it in 2011. And prior to this, I had been photographing within queer communities and the trans communities that I was a part of in the Boston area and then in Chicago. So I had already had a decent amount of time making pictures in those spaces. And I began this body of work in 2011, and it really centered around not just a specific identity, but the process that we each go through to come to understand ourselves on an intimate level, particularly when our identities require an active negotiation, and then how we connect with people from that place. So I was thinking about desire and intimacy. I was thinking about the ways in which our identities, our very core internal identities, are validated and reflected back at us through relationship with other people. There are a lot of self-portraits in my work. Self-portraiture has been a part of my practice from the very beginning, and it continues to be a significant part of my practice. And that, for me, has done a couple of things. One is it really clearly locates me within the community that I'm working within. It locates me as someone who's asking these questions that I'm exploring and asking of other people. But I've also found over the years that it really, by me sharing my own story in a personal way, it allows space for other people to share their stories with me. And this cycle is incredibly valuable to me, not just as an artist, but also as a person. There are some still life images in this series. And it's interesting, I always find still lifes actually much harder to make than portraits, which people are surprised by. But again, I was thinking about this need we all have for connection and relationship, and the stills I was making at the time were usually pairs of objects, and they often referenced a body. So for me, these were a way of speaking about this need for connection without depicting just a specific couple. Again, another self-portrait. I published my first book of this work in 2015, Every Breath We Drew, and the Work Center has one copy, which I have no idea how. They're hard to come by, and they're really expensive on Amazon, so if you want it, you should grab it. They basically don't exist anymore. And this was really important to me, both as an artist. I've always thought of my work in terms of books. I think like many of us who are drawn to photography, I discovered photography in the book form, and for me, that discovery also overlapped with me looking for identity. I was looking for signs of myself when I was a teenager, and I originally found the work of Catherine Opie, and it was literally the first place where I saw someone who looked like me at the time. So I've always thought in books, I love that they're fairly accessible, they're more democratic than an exhibition, and they allow you as the maker to really control this little world that then you can share with someone. So books have been a really important part of my practice and also my career. This is an installation view of this work, and I just wanted to give you a sense of how the work looks in space. I work with medium and large format cameras, and so there's a lot of detail in the prints. And I've always felt really strongly that I want the work to be large enough that a viewer can approach it in the gallery space and have this meaningful one-to-one interaction and engage with the person I'm photographing in their own emotional way, intimate way. But I've never wanted the work to be so large that it becomes larger than life and towers over you. So I'm thoughtful about the exhibition space and how the work exists in physical form. I'm also increasingly thinking about sequence as a kind of poetics, which you'll see increases with even more recent work, but I almost always show multiple size images together. This is an installation view from the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. It was from an exhibition called Personal Space, Self-Portraits on Paper. And I put this in because I get really excited when curators and museums include my work in exhibitions that are not themed around only photography or only queerness. I really want my work to be in dialogue with the broader culture, but specifically art history and other media and other artists. I have a background working in fine art museums, and I'm really influenced by old master painting, portrait painting, printmaking. And so I love when my work is placed in a larger dialogue and not kind of reduced down to one of its elements. So the second body of work I'm going to share with you is called Family Pictures. I've been working on this since 2012, and you may have noticed in the earlier pictures there was a picture of me and my partner Vanessa, and that was sort of the beginning of this work. We met in 2012, and we began making pictures together. And because I was thinking about Every Breath We Drew as being about intimacy and desire and relationships, I just, for some time, I thought that the pictures of Vanessa were just part of that work. And then some time passed, and I realized I had like 20 portraits, and they were different, and this was becoming its own project. And then, simultaneously, I have always made work with my mom. Even prior to this, we had made, when I was learning photography, earlier black and white work, I had always made pictures of me and my mom together. And, I was about 5 or 6 years into making this work when I sort of took a look at everything I had. Pictures of Vanessa, pictures of us together, pictures of me and my mom, self-portraits, and I really began to conceptualize it as a body of work. And I started to think about it as a singular project that I was working on. And I share that with an eye to the students in the room. Like, there is this process sometimes where you're just creating, and it's not always clear on the outset what it's going to become, but you just have to trust the process. And then there's these different moments where it kind of comes together and then starts to evolve in a different way. I like a lot of things about this work. One is just the passage of time. Time is an important element in a lot of my work. I often photograph people over a period of time, multiple photo shoots. But in this project in particular, the passage of time is really a core element of the project. I've been working on it for 11 years now, and I just started exhibiting the work last year. I really wanted to hold it back and let it have some weight to it. And I'm currently imagining publishing a book in like 15 years. So I conceive of it as this longer term project. Another thing that's been really interesting is just formally as a photographer, when you're making photographs of the same people for 10 or 11 years, you have to make different kinds of images. And so it pushed me technically and formally. I also love the intimacy it creates by carving out this time to make pictures with people who are meaningful to me. And then the other thing is I really love that it has a lot of topics and subject matter that I'm interested in, like relationships, family, connection, desire, gender, sexuality. aging, you know, but none of these things are the singular focus. They're all kind of behind this idea of a family. And so I'm really interested in how I can explore all of those things through this very subjective lens. So Vanessa and I have a kiddo who's now 5, which is hard to believe. And when she was pregnant, I kept photographing her because that was my life, and that's, you know, I always document my life. And I made this image 2 days after Eleanor was born. We were in the hospital. We live in St. Louis, Missouri, and we were in the hospital there. And I actually didn't take my camera originally. I wasn't planning on photographing. I just really wanted to be present as a parent, which, as I've learned now, remains a tension when you make work with your family. It's like, well, when do I pull out the camera and when am I just her parent? And that's changed a lot as she's gotten to be different ages, even in the first 5 years. And I actually had intended to only photograph Vanessa. And it was after I made this picture, she said, you know, you should make a picture of yourself. And it became this diptych. And I've just started showing this work. And it's really interesting because in a very short amount of time, I've gotten a lot of feedback about how few representations of queer families there are, and particularly queer parenting, and particularly butch or transmasculine parenting. And representation is really important to me in my work, especially representing queer lives and queer experience and my own experience as a full complex person who happens to be queer and non-binary. But that really hit home to me that, you know, I think a lot of people in a broader culture have never seen someone who looks like me holding a baby, or they've really never seen an image like this. So it's continued my drive to make the work and caused me to really double down on not just the importance of making it for myself, but thinking about what that means to put representations of queer families out in the world. And I often get asked, like, what do you hope for the future of queer art? And, you know, one thing I hope for is like that we have lots of those representations. Like, I don't want to be the one, you know, and I'm not implying I would be, but I still have curators who are like, oh yeah, we have a Catherine Opie photograph in the collection. Like, your work will be in dialogue with that. And it's like, that was 20 years ago. Like, you don't, you know, it's like you don't have anything else. But anyway, that's a whole other subject. This was made here in Provincetown. I end up making a lot of work when I'm here in the summers. This is Vanessa and Eleanor in the shower. At the place we stay on the West End, and I just photographed them again in this shower last week. So I'm really excited about that, and excited about returning to the same place over time. This is my mom and her partner, Chris, and I also photographed them in this same location 4 years later. This is me and Eleanor when she was 18 months old. She was easy to photograph up until about 2. And then 3 and 4 were like almost a complete loss. I was having like an existential crisis that I wasn't photographing my child because I work with a medium format camera. I work on a tripod. I work with natural light. I trained on a 4x5 view camera. The way that I work is very formal, and I really didn't want to change the way that I work. And so, you know, 3 and 4 were almost a loss. And then right around 4, actually last year here at the Work Center, she like struck a pose, and it was sort of the beginning of this next chapter of Eleanor. Another thing I'm thinking about in this work is that for me, having a child completely changed my orientation to the world, but it also changed my relationship with my own mother. And I think where in the past, I always viewed myself as the child in relation to her, having my own child complicated that for me. And I think that's starting to come into the work. I see it in a picture like this. And one thing I'm really thinking about now in this project is that I have an aging mother who is lesbian identified. So what does it mean to have a queer parent growing older? And then what does it mean to be a queer and non-binary parent raising a child? And I'm interested in those 3 generations and all of those dynamics. I put in a few more recent pictures of Eleanor because I mostly wanted you all to see that she got bigger. So I'll go through these kind of quickly. For a long time, I was like only showing a baby photo. And I was like, no, she's 5 now. But these were made in my backyard. She has a really striking gaze. She'll only give it to me for like 1 second when she really feels like it. So I've had to learn to change my approach a little bit and react quickly. But again, I'm really imagining, I'm imagining her becoming an adult and then me making a book of the entirety of this work. This was just a few weeks ago. So I mentioned I just started exhibiting this work. This was one of the first exhibitions at the Mass Art Museum, and it was in an exhibition called Designing Motherhood, Things That Make and Break Our Births. And it was situated within a larger exhibition about reproductive justice. And I really love when things go beyond just a single art exhibition. And that's now traveling. It's at the Gates Foundation in Seattle. And then this is the first larger selection of this work. It's in a show called Kinship that's up right now at the National Portrait Gallery in DC. And it's a group show with 7 artists, and each artist had their own room. So I have this room where you're kind of surrounded by the family work, and I'm really excited about seeing it in space. I'm excited about having it in an institution like the National Portrait Gallery, not only for myself, but just knowing how people feel when they go into an institution like that and what that means for queer people. And I get messages on Instagram all the time from people who are like, I never thought I could have a family, and I encountered your work. You know, it's just, this stuff is so important when you don't see yourself as all of you know. It's challenging. So the Smithsonian made a catalog, and they put this picture on the cover, which of course I was excited for myself, but I also just really was struck by that choice. Like, this mainstream institution put this image on the cover. It felt significant. So the last project I'm going to talk to you about is called Look at Me Like You Love Me. It's really an extension of Every Breath We Drew. I work in these incredibly long-term serial projects where one idea morphs into another idea. And I view this work as my ongoing soul work, like the way that I really connect to the world. But most of this work was made from 2015 to 2022. And I was still thinking about a lot of the same themes. I was, thinking about construction of identity and need for connection with others and relationship. But I had grown older, and so the questions I was asking started to feel different. And then also the pandemic hit. And I think for me, my work took a deep emotional and psychological dive during the pandemic, where I was still making pictures in the vein that I was making them before. But I was just thinking so much. This is actually the last picture I made right before the pandemic. I was thinking so much about our need for connection and how we as complex humans are validated through others, and then what happens when that's severed. And then I was thinking a lot about time, and I was thinking about having a limited amount of time to live and what that means in terms of a kind of urgency. I often photograph really early in the morning or really late in the day, and that's partially, during the pandemic, it was partially out of practicality, but it's also because I love the transience of the light that time of day, and I love how that speaks to queerness and fluidity. I love how it speaks to a kind of urgency to live and be present. This body of work I published as a book, which I'll show you in a minute, but the book has my own narrative texts in it, which is the first time that I've published my own creative writing. I've worked with text in a lot of different ways, interviews, but this was the first time it was really my own creative writing. And throughout the text and the images, I think, there are these themes of beauty and also loss, either actual experienced loss or a fear of loss or the risk of loss. And I really feel like this work centers around this duality of knowing that, like having that weight, but then the flip side of that for me is this desire to be really in the present and this urgency to live authentically and to live a meaningful life, and kind of straddling those two things. So there are some hints of just incredible beauty, and then also this undertone of struggle, and thinking about what it means, especially for us as queer people, when we have to struggle so much to come out the other side as who we are, and then how do you remain gentle and open and vulnerable? And that's really a sweet spot for me in terms of my work and the people I'm interested in photographing. This image was made here in Provincetown. This is one of my workshop students in 2019. This was sunrise at Herring Cove Beach. I also mentioned I live in Missouri, and being surrounded by that landscape has really infused my work. This was made in a park. I have some St. Louis friends here. This was made in Tower Grove Park, which is right by my house. It's a 300-acre park where I spend a lot of time, and I watch the light, and I watch the plants, and I walk there. But I also make a lot of work there. But I've been increasingly thinking about bringing in the natural elements and thinking about what does it mean to represent queerness and queer love and queer people and queer relationships in a natural, expansive space outdoors, not only in these private interior spaces. So a combination of my surroundings, where I find myself living in Missouri, and also just the evolution of my work. I'm increasingly bringing more and more of the landscape into the photographs. This was also made here in Provincetown. I feel like I have to tell you all of the pictures that were made in Provincetown. And now this one's for fun, so I don't normally, so this is the last one that was in the book. This one's new, and I had to put it in because Chung Hao is here tonight. And we met last year here and made this portrait. You met me at 6 a.m., I think. It was early. And on one of my last days here, and we went to Herring Cove Beach. And we're gonna make pictures tomorrow, so. Just had to have a little local shout out. So this is the book, Look at Me Like You Love Me. I'm not gonna read you any of the texts just out of time, but if you're curious, of course, there's copies in the back. And then a few more installation images that are more recent. So I mentioned I've been increasingly thinking about both the exhibition space and the book space, but in this case, the exhibition space, as a kind of immersive poetic experience. And I'm thinking a lot about sequence and editing and creating a rhythm through things like color and gesture and pose, and thinking about the mood of the exhibition as a whole. These two images were from the St. Louis Art Museum in 2021. And then I've also been exhibiting outside, which I find really exciting. I think some of this shift was the pandemic. This is an outdoor exhibition as part of a photography festival in Australia. But I love this idea of people encountering fine art work outside of a fine art institution. And that's been a really significant part of my practice as well, especially with another body of work called To Survive on the Shore, which focuses on trans older adults. I've really worked to have that outside of fine art spaces, but I do it with this work too. So I'm increasingly interested in kind of bringing the work to people and not only having them come into these spaces. This is another example last year in Berlin. And then the show from the St. Louis Art Museum has traveled to some other venues. This is at the University Galleries at Illinois State. It's a very small town in Illinois. And I loved having the work there. One thing about living in the Midwest has been really interesting is I love like exhibiting in these smaller spaces, and I find it very meaningful. But also in this exhibition, this was the first time I brought the text onto the wall and had writing from the book on the wall in the exhibition space. So I'm thinking a lot about how to push that further, and I have an upcoming exhibition in Santa Fe, and I was gonna have text on the wall, but I just recorded an audio track of myself reading all of the texts in the book. And the room will be dark gray with images and my voice. And so I'm continually thinking about how to bring even more writing and text and storytelling into the work than I can do just in photographs. And the last thing I'm gonna show you is I made a portfolio of this work, and this is a box set that comes with slightly smaller prints and at a more accessible price point. And this is really meant to make the work more available to teaching institutions and university museums. So a part of my practice and my career has always been not just making the work, but thinking about how to place it in institutions where it will get seen and used in classes and shown. And so this is one way that I've gone about that. So I'm gonna stop there. Thank you all very much. Do I need this guy? Okay. Oh.
Another round of applause for Jess T. Dugan. Does that reach your?
Yeah. Yep.
Yes. I forgot about this part. Maybe I blocked it out too.
One note, please do speak into the microphone because we are recording this. And so for people who are watching online, you'll need to speak into the microphone for them to hear you.
Okay. This is a question for Alex. You've written that the problem with having an imagination is that you can scare yourself out of your whole life. if you're not careful. Can you talk to us about how you write about the things that scare you?
Apparently, I abandon them, and if they survive, I revise them. But it's interesting. I just gave my students a writing prompt this afternoon that was born out of a conversation with Mary Gateskill about her story, The Other Place, which is an absolutely terrifying story that she came up with by this process where she was imagining this fear she had, which is at the time she was living in a home in the center of a wooded clearing, and she kept imagining that there was someone in the woods spying on her. And she made it into a narrator. And then has this narrator who is clearly a predator, whose son is also seemingly showing the signs of being a troubling child. And it's a whole story about this time that he almost killed a woman. And that's how she did it. And so I am experimenting with trying that out, with just, instead of letting yourself be so afraid that you try to narrate from that, if you can in some way, like literally embody the fear, maybe even into the person you least want to talk to. But there's also something to be said for, I wrote about this in my essay collection, about this way that that you can imagine yourself as a failure, and it's a narrative that's incredibly vivid, and it keeps your attention, and you revise it constantly to make it perfect. But you can never publish it because you're just telling yourself this story in your head. And the thing to do, whether or not you choose this method that I just described, is to try as much as possible to let that go, and to instead make the thing that you can write down, that you can revise, that you can. I think so many writing students, so many writers, myself, we're all afraid of doing the thing that we don't want to do, but we can focus on that so much that we forget to focus on what do we want to do? What is the thing itself? And we have so much control over whether that goes wrong or not.
Hi, beautiful work, both of you. I loved it. This is a question for both of you because you're both, it sounds like, working within sort of durational artworks right now, which means encountering your past younger selves and their aesthetic sense, their limitations, their convictions and concerns, and surely you've changed. And to be working in the same space as that younger self, how does it feel? Surprising? Are you impressed by them? Are you embarrassed by them? Sort of what comes up as you're in that dialogue with the work of your younger self?
Want me to start? I love that question. Thank you. And, I think for me, like I said, I learn about myself from the work. And I've become increasingly interested in this idea of an archive, and even just an archive of your own life, and revisiting work you made at a certain point in time, and realizing who you were at that moment in time, and knowing that's not who you are now. And I feel like I had an acute sense of that with Look at Me Like You Love Me, because it came out of this very specific moment. And I was aware, even at the moment of publishing it, that I would be a very different person the next time I made something. But I sort of like this idea of like planting a flagpole, like this is who I am right now, and I love what you said, like just accepting that, like, and putting it out there. So I guess that was the first thing to come to mind. I mean, I think I'm also making some work right now that looks back at earlier parts of my life, either like mining my own childhood. I've made a few videos that pull from snapshots. And so that's another thing I just find interesting, like revisiting your past from your present vantage point, even as you're super aware that that's all going to change, you know?
It's so interesting, right, to find something that you wrote when you were 28 that, and actually to keep finding it. That's the other thing, is that this discovery comes out of a trove of writing that I basically gave up on in the mid-90s when I turned and wrote what I thought would be this incredibly conventional autobiographical novel called Edinburgh, which is not that, just FYI. And then, but that's the sort of thinking of your youth, right? Where you're sort of, you're not sure what you can believe in. You're not sure what you can endure, what everyone else will endure. You know, the narrator of that novel that I found is certainly like the obnoxious kid I was in a lot of ways, who is about to, you know, really go through it. And I think at the time I couldn't face it, but also I couldn't face what I felt sure would be like, you know, I had no faith in the publishing industry at the time. I had no faith in the larger audiences, none of it. I didn't believe any of them would care about it. One of my essays in my essay collection, Girl, for example, is an essay, sorry, the essay is called Girl, the essay collection has another title. That's something that I had it in my files for 20 years. And I kept thinking, I should probably revise this. And then I finally did. It was my first inclusion in Best American, and I was like, you are such a dummy. It's just incredible how stupid you are. How do you survive anything? And so, you know, and then my agent was like, so what's in your files? And I was like, the story collection? And she said, why haven't I seen it? I've worked with you for 20 years. And I said, I just thought of it as juvenilia. And she said, were you a child when you wrote it? And it really was like this number. I was doing so many numbers on myself to like keep myself from putting that work out. It's weird. But I think that's the part about working with the work of your youthful self, is that you're dealing with like all of those pretensions that you had.
I think for me too, this came to mind as you were speaking. I've had to work to let myself be free to make what I want to make now. And I think there's this way, especially when you begin to have a career, and especially when I feel like it's heightened when you're queer, like there's this pressure to have everything be in this certain lane or this certain dialogue. And I think for me, part of what I've pushed against, both within myself as a maker and also outwardly, like with the reception, is wanting the freedom to make the work that I want to make as a person and to just let it evolve as I evolve. And I think, like you said, when you make a body of work for, 12, 15 years, there's this tendency to compare the newer work to the older work. And I've really found a lot of freedom in just like trying to let that go. But sometimes I feel like people don't want to, they outwardly, they're like, but it's about gender. And you're like, no, it's not. It's about personhood and like becoming a parent and family, and like, it's not about gender. My body reads in a certain way, but it's actually about all of these other things. And I think perhaps that's heightened when it's this long-term kind of series of imagery,
I'm ready to stop writing about the 90s. I can't stop yet, but soon.
This question is for Jess. Your work each one seems so, each image is arresting, singular, calm. And I'm uninitiated to the large format or medium format. But I understand that, like a lot of photo shoots, what you see is sort of everything is edited away and you see a distilled image. But in the format that you work with, how many images in, say, that time when the sun is setting or rising do you take? Because it could be a terrific trick, but it looks like it's the only one.
Yeah.
So, yeah, just respond, please.
Thank you. Sure. No, I love that question. And it's interesting you say it looks like it's the only one, because I have a process of photographing that's slow. It's very collaborative. It's slow. I really think a lot about the energy I bring to the space and almost trying to create a meditative kind of space between me and the subject. I don't like a lot of people around. And so that slowness of working, for me, it's me trying to find my way to the portrait. I'm trying to find my way visually. I'm trying to find my way emotionally. I'm trying to connect emotionally with the person on the other side and have them connect with me. So I basically think of it as working my way to this final image. And it usually takes an hour, sometimes more. I'll sometimes make 300 exposures, which I have to say is because I work digitally now and I kind of hate the editing down. But I'll have one pose and I'll make like 60 exposures because my frame is the same, the composition's the same, and all I'm doing is adjusting the person's face. I've been doing this a lot this week. I've made a ton of work the past week, and one thing I often do is I'll have someone close their eyes and then open it, and I'll say, I'm going to make the picture when you open your eyes. And I find it's kind of an emotional cleansing. If people are thinking about how they look, or thinking if they have a heightened awareness of the camera, that helps them go a little bit inward and then just present to me from that space. So a lot of what I do is seeking the right kind of emotional moment. And usually within a shoot for me, there's a magical moment where it's the fusion of the form and the light and the color and the emotion, and everything comes together and I can feel it. And what's interesting is sometimes after that happens, the energy is over. And so one thing I've had to learn as a photographer and artist is how to follow that energy curve. And it doesn't matter how many more pictures you make, it's never gonna happen. There's this certain amount of energy that exists. And it becomes a technical challenge to capture that and also be tuned in emotionally at the same time. Sure.
For Jess. Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. I was wondering what kind of poetry you like to engage with when thinking about your photography, or just what poetry brings you joy, since you talked about looking at your work like a poetic sequence.
Oh, that's a great question, and I feel totally outed in a room full of writers. I'm not going to have an amazing answer for you. One thing I will say is the writing I gravitate towards, regardless of the form, is writing that's really centered around a kind of storytelling. And that's what's always resonated with me. Just, memoir, autobiography. So I think a lot of that's a lot of what I pull from. I think for me, when I use the word poetic, I feel like totally shocked. I've never talked to this many writers. I'm thinking of it more as a kind of emotional rhythm, almost like a visual poetry, like a kind of tuning into the energy of the work. I keep doing this because that's just how I kind of view the experience of looking at an exhibition or the book. I want it to be this immersive emotional experience, and thinking a lot about how the accumulation of the images and the text add up to this singular large experience. So that's where I'm kind of coming from. And, with Look at Me Like You Love Me, I often say it was really designed and meant to be a kind of visual poem. And there were certain decisions that went into that. Like in the book, for example, there's no introductory text, there's no curatorial essay, I actually scrapped the acknowledgments because I just wanted the work between two covers. And I didn't ever want to break the fourth wall and have the viewer think about me as an artist. Like I just wanted them to engage with the work. So I think for me, when I say something like poetic or visual poem, that's what I'm really thinking about. Sure.
Okay, this may be peak self-indulgent, but when you were shooting me last year, I did write a poem about being shot by you, and I'll offer it to the class if that doesn't feel like too much.
Sure.
Well, here it goes. Hard rocks shifting below my feet, sand sinking, pulling my calf muscles down, my arms a horsetail, brushing aside beach gnats, curious on my bare torso, my swimsuit too red, so a towel then, and pearls, of course. I'm not like the other boys. Stare at the mechanical eye with 3 legs that lengthen and shrink to look at you dead center, a water spider on the shore. Shudder, snap, whir. I see the whites of it with its eyes with each click. Relax into it. Do what feels natural. Hands clasped behind, body contrapasso. Embody ease, I think, and strength and maybe calm. 1, 2, 3, snap. Snap again. Hold steady for the focus. Breathe in, breathe out. Clear your mind. Close your eyes. Now open them. And remember that you are beautiful. Look at me like you love me, the book says. 2 queers at the edge of the land, at the edge of the sea, reclaiming a moment of freedom, remaking what we had lost, healing through the viewfinder, the viewing, the being seen.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
That could be a perfect way to end.
This is a perfect ending. Go for it. Okay, great. This is a question for both of you, and actually, in a way, it sort of pulls from this. Thank you for your poem. So how do you decide on your subjects? How do you decide on sort of who to write about, who to shoot? And what sort of conversations do you have either with that person, whether it's directly to them or in your mind? Yeah.
Do you want to start?
Sure. It's interesting, how we decide. I went through a really boggling couple of years where I had like so many different projects that I was trying to choose between a memoir, another collection of essays, 2 other novels. My friend Emma Straub sat down with me and listened to me talk about it all, and she's like, I don't even know what to call your problem. And she's like, just pick something. My husband, his advice was like, don't flood the market with Alexander Chee essays. Like, try to do something else first, which is good advice, I think. But something that I guess, I'm always waiting to have something pull harder than the other things because I sort of write like a gardener. And I'm always looking for urgency in a sense, but maybe that's a mistake. I don't know. Finding this book, for example, hasn't pushed it to the top of my list, even though I think I probably should finish it, even though it will be a very different, feels more like receiving raw material that becomes something else, because I know how it all turned out in a way, like I know who didn't turn out to be the police plan. I know how it affected the group. I know where everybody involved is now in the world. I even know how to look for a police plan because I did some of that research recently with Sarah Schulman. And I know that like a lot of these issues that are in the book, ranging from like who gets to protest, who gets to be arrested, who's in the group, how does who's in the group dominate where the group goes, where the attention of the group goes, affect things. You know, we are in a time when I think many people would like to protest more, at a time that it is also so dangerous to protest. States enacting laws that allow cars to just drive over you. So, yeah, I mean, that maybe that's the urgency I need. I don't know. It's always, I think you're always just kind of making it up as you go along. But I'd be curious what.
Yeah, I love that idea of urgency, and I think that rings true for me too. You know, I mentioned that for me, making pictures is just the way I understand myself and relate to the world. So I think there's one element of answering your question that's just very intuitive, and I think it comes from my own psychology. It comes from the questions I'm asking myself. There's just, like, when I meet someone I want to photograph, there's just like an energetic draw, right? And so part of what I do as a photographer is or part of what I have done is learn to tune into that and just follow my own intuition. And that's one thing we're talking about this week in the workshop is it's not so much like how do you make a portrait, but it's like how do you tune in to the thing that's pulling you and then honor it and make space for it and do it, you know, because that's what creates something really compelling. You know, I think in retrospect, I can often identify things that are tangible. Like I like a combination of vulnerability and strength. I'm drawn to a certain kind of androgyny. That, you know, there's a certain kind of energy. I can name things later. But truly in the moment, it's just about following my intuition and allowing myself the space to ask the questions of my life through my work. Yeah.
I like that.
Thank you.